Ships at Sea. This is Blaine Pardo, and welcome to another episode of Writers Fix Problems. We were going to have on Alu Axelman to talk about his new book, The Pocket Guide to Killing Gun Control, but Alu is book solid. You know, he's a new father. He's going to law school full time. He is working full time and he's writing books. I totally get it. But I thought his book was good enough for us to have a discussion around because gun control is one of these things that just doesn't seem to go away. And his book really tackles this head on. As always, I'm going to do a review of the book, but I'm going to actually talk a lot about some of the stuff that's in the book, more so than usual, because we don't have the author on here. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Second Amendment and why it's important. And I think that this is me pontificating a little bit, but it's okay. I run the show, so I get to do stuff like this now and then. It's interesting. Within my own house, my wife has always been against guns and never liked them until I had a crazed stalker threaten my life 2 years ago. And then one of the very first discussions we had is, what guns do we have? Where are they? And how do I use them? And I found this to be very much how a lot of people are about gun control, because it's not about gun control. It's about your ability to protect yourself. That having been said, let's talk a little bit about Alu Axelman's book, The Pocket Guide to Killing Gun Control. My review of this is as follows. This is not a big book. It really doesn't have to be to get to the point. The ownership of the means to defend yourself is under assault in our country. This pocket guide gives anyone the ability to dismantle the usual arguments to take away people's Second Amendment rights. This guide equips readers with topics, starting with who decides and who is fit to own a firearm, to the Constitution itself, to natural human rights, to the real impact or lack thereof of gun control laws. The appendix, which is easily more than half the book, goes into the ATF's abuses of authority, the Founding Fathers' intent with the Second Amendment, legal and legislative shenanigans that have been pulled on years, right out to tips on how to buy and safely care for your firearms. So who should own this book? Very simply put, this is a book that you give as a gift to people who tell you that we need more gun control. You buy them a copy of this book, you either send it to them as an ebook or you send them a physical copy of it and tell them to read that book. Then they can actually have a coherent conversation about this subject. So that having been said, that's my quick review of The Pocket Guide to Killing Gun Control. But let's talk a little bit about gun control, because the book goes into this and it's very concise. It's only a 91-page book. It's very concise in how it does this, and I think it's very important to really take a deep dive into this subject. Let's take a look first at the Second Amendment, which a lot of people I know tuning into this show are probably familiar with. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, let's be very clear about this. What the Constitution does is it says, look, you have rights. And it doesn't tell you what rights the government gives you. It tells you what rights the government should never touch. Thanks for pulling this up, Watcher. The Second Amendment is really straightforward in this. It's going, look, you can't touch the right to bear arms. It shall not be infringed upon. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. We were dealing with founding fathers who had just come out of a war to fight for their independence and freedom against Great Britain. And they fully understood the implications of the Second Amendment. We're going to talk a little bit about what they said about that. And I've got a couple of quotes I pulled from this book that really solidify around that. It's amazing to me because this was about your ability to protect and defend yourself. And it's saying, in essence, you have the right to own a weapon. Now, a lot of people have argued that this has to do with a militia. and I really gets on my nerves. It's one of the primary liberal arguments you hear about gun control. Is it says, oh, well, you have to be part of a militia to own guns. Watcher, if you pull that up again, the comma here is really important. It says, look, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, okay, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. That comma is not a mistake, and it's an important piece of punctuation here, because it's saying, look, we got to have a militia. You have to have a means of protecting yourself, be it an army, a militia, or whatever. That being the case, the right for the people to bear arms can't be infringed on. You can't take that away from them. It didn't say, well, but you can't own cannons or you can't own, any other weapons of war. It says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed upon. And that's a primary liberal argument has been, well, we don't have militias, so that's not the case. This doesn't apply, that makes the rule changeable. And that's totally dismantled. And it really makes no sense whatsoever. Another primary argument that liberals have always kind of thrown out is we've always restricted guns. And Alo Axelman in his book does go into this and really breaks down a lot of the Supreme Court rulings around guns and gun control. And it comes down to this. The Constitution tells you that you have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to own a weapon to do that. And it tells you that the government should not be tampering with that right. So the concept of, well, we've always restricted guns, etc., really only came about in the late 20th century, mid 20th and late 20th century. Up until then, we didn't mess with that law whatsoever.
Hey, I'd like to go back real quick and just talk about one other facet of the Second Amendment that often gets misconstrued when people are trying to make the militia argument. This is found in the Bill of Rights, right? Which every other item in the Bill of Rights lists things the government are not allowed to do to individuals. Why would this particular clause, the second, be the only one that refers to what the government's not allowed to do to specific groups that are supposedly run by the government itself? Was this a statement meant to allow the government to arm itself? No, that's not what any of the Bill of Rights is for. The entire argument is bullshit on its face.
Oh, it anyhow, is. It falls flat. But it's done by the armchair constitutional attorneys out there who go, well, this is what it says, and this is my interpretation of it. Well, I'm sorry. I'm just reading to you what it actually says. And that comma really is an important piece to this. We've always been told that we've always in our country restricted guns. And what it really tells me is we should go back and take a look at some of those things, because we really shouldn't be restricting a lot of the restrictions that we have in place if you take the Constitution at what it really says. We also get the argument from the left often saying it's the gun's fault. When you look at gun violence and the way it's posed in the media, and that phrasing even, gun violence, there's not just violence, there's gun violence. They always take the approach that it's the gun's fault. We don't do this with any other wave of crime that's out there. With strangulations, we don't say, these are strangulation violence and that we have to go ban ropes or nylons or whatever people are using to strangle people. When it comes to knives being used to commit crimes, which are used, by the way, on millions of people over each year are used to commit crimes, we don't go, well, knife crimes need to be tracked and we're going to do this. But when it comes to gun control, they actually go out of their way, the left, to track what they term as gun violence. And again, their focus is it's the gun's fault. They remove the element of personal responsibility, that an individual is responsible for his or her actions. And I think it's very important when you're looking at something like gun control, because every other crime assumes that the individual is the person who is responsible. But what gun control advocates want to do is make it about the gun. And it is the only tool, the only man-made thing that they go after and say, let's regulate this because it's the gun's fault. And so, I mean, to me, it's crazy. Another very liberal argument, we get this from the mumbler in chief, President Biden. The government has tanks, helicopters, and nukes. And because of that, your ownership of the gun, if you think you're doing it to, oppose the government, well, we have tanks, we have helicopters, we have nukes. And I'm pleased to say that the government is so fearful of me owning a firearm that they have to threaten the full weight of the United States military against me. And that on its own tells me that the ownership of the gun to protect your rights, and if necessary, take action against an unlawful government, is important and inherent and something incredibly American. And to me, that when Biden came out with those comments about, well, what are you going to do? We have tanks, we have all this. You're literally threatening the American people with this. Who do you think you are? And if my ownership of a handgun or an assault weapon or whatever you want to call it, by the way, and we'll talk about the stupid definitions in a minute. It's absolutely crazy that my ownership of those implements are so violent and so extreme that you would threaten, to roll tanks on the street at me. So, Watcher, do you have any thoughts along those lines? Because I know you probably heard those quotes from Biden.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there's that, which is a good point of that, but there's a lot of other points which are a tank is a steel box full of gasoline and ammunition, and it needs to remain full of gasoline and ammunition, and it can't haul the gasoline or ammunition itself. It tends to need other vehicles for that, which are not nearly so well armored, and whose occupants are not nearly so well armored, nor so wary. Well, gee, it'd be a real shame if you tried to pull that stuff in an area where there's no safe areas for you to practice the logistics necessary to carry out modern combat. That would sure be a shame.
It's crazy. It's amazing. And a lot of this is the left playing with definitions, and they like trying to
semantic warfare. Absolutely.
There is a whole level of this that is communication, and it is laid out against the right, or so they perceive the right. It's really leveled against people who own guns, etc. And Watcher, I sent you over a little graphic, if we could pull that up. And this is a joke, but it's also incredibly serious, and the one that I always focus on is the assault weapon one. And I'm sure the rest of you guys will read into these and get a chuckle, or it'll raise your blood pressure one way or the other. But assault weapons are always the one that I hear about. And I always kind of cringe at that. And I've had to explain it to my wife a couple of times too, because she's like, well, assault weapons, where they're semi-automatic like that. And I said, I went downstairs and pulled out, my Sig Sauer and said, this, by your definition, then is an assault weapon. The mechanic of a semi-automatic weapon is the same, whether it's in a pistol or whether it's in a rifle. What changes with this is if it's a rifle, it's a long barrel weapon, so it's inherently more accurate and it looks more menacing. But looks can't alone define what an assault weapon is. And for the left,
sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and in fact, the vast majority of quote gun crime or illegal use of firearms is done not by assault weapons or long arms, but by pistols.
Yeah, it is. And what's amazing too, and my wife has actually seen some real life combat footage that I've showed her, how incredibly inaccurate even a pistol is once you get beyond 50 feet, unless you really know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You could spray off a whole bunch of shots and somehow miss everybody. It's that Pulp Fiction moment,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Empty out their guns at the two lead characters. They look around, they're like nothing hit them.
Yeah. So I don't know if you knew this before we did this today, Blaine, but I used to be a former marksmanship instructor for the United States Marine Corps, and one of the statistics back in the day that we used to track is police officers shots versus hits in various different combat scenarios, because theirs are a lot better tracked than ours are, as you might imagine, because there's a forensics team going behind counting all the casings and bullet holes and everything. And most trained police officers, even in range, generally only manage 1 in 10 shots.
Yeah. Guns are intimidating. I get it. And if you don't know anything about guns, they can be scary. And we have gone out of our way to remove a lot of that training. When I was a kid, the Boy Scouts had ample training in it. And we actually had police officers come into our elementary and junior high and show us weapons and show us safety rules around the weapons, what we shouldn't touch, what we shouldn't do, things along those lines. Now that would never be allowed. I doubt we probably had a cop come into a classroom and do gun safety in probably 40 years. I think it's a mistake. We need to educate people about guns as much as possible. We live in a society where those guns are out there. So I'm not surprised by what you said, Watcher. I witnessed it when I went through just this last year. I went to Best Ranger competition, and I watched guys who their entire lives are using these firearms, and it's hard to hit every round. It's hard to hit every other round in some cases.
Especially heart pumping, all kinds of chemicals dumping into your system. Yep. It's neat.
And Alu brings this up too, and it's one of the chapters or sections of his book that I enjoyed probably the most, because he said, should we ban guns from those that might do harm? And it was really interesting because I liked what the author did in the book about that. He came out and he said, look, who's going to make that call? The government? Legislatures, and he specifically called out legislators. He's like, do you want Elizabeth Warren? Do you want Hillary Clinton? Do you want people of that ilk determining what you can and can't have to protect yourself? And I thought that was really good. And he also said, so what's the criteria that you're going to use? Now, I'm a person, I've been on antidepressants for probably 20 years at this point. I'm not a threat to anybody, probably more to myself than anybody else in the world. But, I've been on antidepressants. Does that mean I wouldn't be precluded from owning a gun? What is your criteria going to be? And don't tell me, well, we'll figure it out. You have to explain to that. And what are you going to do about the people who fit that criteria who already own guns? Are you going to go and round them up? We'll talk about that in a few minutes too. But to me, this whole, red flagging of people in advance of them owning guns is crazy, because it's just, you have no means for doing that. And it may stop an assault, but it also may remove somebody's capability to defend themselves. So where do you want to draw the lines when it comes to freedom?
In fact, it's also most likely to remove someone's ability to defend themselves. And look, there's a lot of arguments a lot of people make around a lot of different things, specifically like, oh, we need to take it away from the people who have schizophrenia and the like, because that could be terrible. When, the fact is, people with schizophrenia are like 5 to 6 times more likely to suffer assault as people without. You're disarming the very people who need it most.
Well, and we can't agree in this country what makes up a mental disorder. Are you going to say PTSD?
Oh, facts. Oh, facts. Oh, facts. In fact, there are many veterans who do not seek care for what is clearly PTSD because they fear the government's ability to remove their ability to have firearms and therefore then go untreated for PTSD.
Yeah. To me, it drives me nuts. And these are people who have the best working knowledge of guns outside of, gunsmiths. They know every aspect of a gun. And we're going to take away their right to own one. The argument is, well, it's the classic one too. Well, how could you need a gun like this for hunting purposes? And my argument, I've had people throw that to me. Why would you need a rifle to go hunting or whatever? If you need a 30-round clip, and I always crack up when they say clip. If you have a 30-round clip, you're not much of a hunter. And I'm like, what I own my gun for is none of your business. None. I don't have to explain shit to you. I don't have to explain any aspect of the attachments I put on that weapon. I don't have to explain anything about that weapon whatsoever. I do not owe you that explanation in a free society.
Unless we're at the range and you pull it out. And I mean, that's just, come on, man. No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. But yeah, no, you're completely correct. There is no justification for what we're getting into, and a lot of this stuff is what surprises me, Blaine, even now, like as a marksmanship instructor, it shocked me how many Hollywood myths I had to overcome in teaching people how to shoot correctly, but it shocks me how many Hollywood myths are involved in lawmaking around guns. You mentioned attachments specifically, like the Hollywood myth that a silencer or more accurately a suppressor makes a gun sound essentially like a nail gun going off is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in my entire life.
I know. I'll tell you a true story. My grandfather taught me to shoot. My grandfather had a great sense of humor. So the first time he took me out with a shotgun, we went out in the field and there was a tree full of crows. And he goes, okay, you're loaded with bird shot in the shotgun. And he told me, hold the shotgun butt about 4 to 5 inches from your shoulder. So I'm out with the gun way out in front of me. And he goes, so you do that when you shoot.
Oh,
and I
no.
pulled the trigger on a shotgun, and not only did it hit my shoulder, it took me right to my ass.
Oh yeah.
And I was
Probably
like,
double up.
oh man, I'm looking, I've already bruised up from this thing. And he goes, so what'd you learn? and I kind of laughed. So later on, it was probably a year or two later, he had a feral cat in the barn. And he goes, okay, let's go in there. I want you to go inside the barn and shoot the cat. It's up in the rafters. And he goes, you got birdshot. You need to shoot. We need to get this cat out of there. I went in there and I fired the shotgun in a barn. and I remember when I came out, he's like, so what did you learn? And I could still barely hear him. And from that point on, I was like, every Hollywood movie to me, when they show people shooting in a car or shooting in a room, and I don't care if you're using a suppressor or whatever you're using, you fire a gun indoors, I have news for you. You are not hearing anything for 10, 15 minutes easily.
It's actually one of the things that I don't know if you've ever seen the animated show Archer, but it's one of the things that, I love the most about that is that he's constantly like, what? I'm sorry, I have tinnitus because I constantly shoot guns indoors.
Yes. And I always make a point when I'm working on my books. That's one of the things I do. It's like, oh my God, it doesn't matter. If you're firing a gun indoors, it's a problem. But anyway, I digress because we all have fun little gun stories from our past. Let's get back a little bit to Alo Axelman's book and the Pocket Guide to Killing Gun Control. He really makes an interesting argument in the book around other countries that ban guns or other cities that ban guns or municipalities and what the impact is. So he had a great scenario in there, and I want to relay it to folks who are tuned in today. Finland has 5.5 million people, 1.5 million civilian-owned guns, and they average about 70 total homicides a year. And, as Alo put it, it's not too shabby. So, you look at that and you go, well, clearly they have a lot of guns in a relatively small country. How come they don't have the murders that we do? Well, he makes a good point with using the state of Wyoming. He says Wyoming has 550,000 people and 114,000 registered guns. Now, remember that registered guns are those where you've gone out and purchased them, filled out the appropriate paperwork. It doesn't cover things like buying and trading between private owners, which isn't entirely infringed upon in Wyoming, etc. So, when you get down to it per capita, Wyoming probably has more than 3 times guns than in any other place in the United States, just counting the registered weapons. But Wyoming has an average crime rate of 20 gun-related homicides a year. In fact, when you break it down, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Wyoming historically have had very little restriction on weapons and firearms, and they're the 3 of the top places to live in the United States when it comes in terms of gun violence.
Yep.
And so the problem to point at the issue of it's the mechanical device, it's the gun that is the cause of all these problems. If you believe that, then half of the people in Wyoming should be dead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've seen many statistics on this, but so America is like 111th out of gun crime total. But if you remove Chicago, Miami, New York, and Los Angeles from the list, we suddenly plummet to like the 11th safest country for gun crime in the world.
Yeah, you raise a good point, and Axelman does this in the book as well. He goes, gun ownership laws don't stop gun violence, and he mentioned some of the same cities you did, by the way. Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, and St. Louis all have incredibly restrictive gun control laws, but rank top in murders. DC is the worst. Highest gun restriction laws in the country in DC. You can't even carry a loaded gun without a permit. You can't even own a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds. You can't have that magazine in the gun in DC. Yet gun violence is up 6%, including this year alone, a 49% increase in carjacking, all of which, by the way, involve guns. DC, as of last week, and this is my statistic, not Alo's, has had 105 homicides this year alone. This is a city that has had historically the most oppressive gun control laws of any city in the country. And yet we've lost 100 people in that city. Now, it's nothing compared to, for example, overdose deaths from fentanyl. That's a whole different subject I'd love to explore at some point. So when you look at this, you start going, well, having the laws doesn't stop any of the problems related to gun control. All of these school shootings that have taken place, every single school shooting that has taken place in a place where the signs are clearly posted that this is a gun-free zone. It's against the law to have your gun there. When you try to legislate immoral and illegal people who are performing activities that are beyond the scope of the law, they're not going to follow the law by their very nature. So putting out more laws in the books doesn't actually solve anything. And I think Axelman does a great job in his book hitting on this. Do you have any thoughts on that, Watcher?
No, I wish I would have read it, but I completely agree. Look, prohibition hasn't worked on anything.
I see we've got somebody here who says, is it ZA? Is that
I think he means South Africa.
South Africa has lower private firearm ownership than in the UK, even when you count illegally owned guns. And we still have the second highest murder rate per capita. It's not the guns. Hey, thanks for sharing that, Michael. I really do appreciate that. It is just absolutely the truth. The laws are not going to change what's going to happen. So what is this really all about? Now, Axelman doesn't go there.
If you don't mind it, I'd like to point out one more example of that, which is Mexico. there's only one gun store, one legal gun store in all of Mexico.
I had no idea.
It's in Mexico City. It's run by the government, and you need very specific government licenses in order to get a gun. Every other gun in Mexico is illegal. Where are all the guns coming from?
Well, this is what DC argues. DC's argument is every time they bring this up and they point it out to them, they say, well, the problem is Virginia and Maryland are next door and they have too liberal gun control laws. Now, the truth is Maryland has very restrictive gun control laws. Maryland is crazy about limiting your ownership of firearms. Virginia less so, but we still have restrictions on gun ownership, just like all the states do. You have to undergo background checks and everything else. So the concept that somehow we're feeding all these guns into DC, or that we're that illegal people who commit crimes are not going to be able to get guns is absolutely crazy. All I can tell you is if you ever watch a show On Patrol Live on the weekends, which I recommend, it's hilarious. It's live officers out on the streets. There hasn't been a single episode that I have seen where they haven't confiscated an illegal handgun from someone that they've pulled over and for a traffic violation or some other violation.
Well, and I kind of have a newer age question about this. Does he go into 3D printing at all?
He does talk very little about that. You could almost do a whole book on that alone. Frankly, I own a 3D printer, and I'm pretty familiar with some of the higher end resins and stuff. If you're crazy enough to print a gun,
it wouldn't be resin. They make it out of FDM, and it's usually impregnated FDM.
Yeah, but boy, I'll tell you, I wouldn't mess with a gun.
Well, I'll show you some videos. The technology has come an incredibly long way, and there's actually multiple different armed guerrilla groups fighting various different long-term campaigns using nothing but 3D printed weapons.
Well, the genie's out of the bottle on that. What are you going to do? Round up the 3D printers? And how do you, it's kind of like sharing a PDF. A file that's out there that shows how to print the gun, an object file or an STL, if it's out there, it's out there. There's no way to round that stuff up and prevent it from being shared, And to me, I think it's just one of those subjects where I'm like, I don't think that's as big a problem as the media makes it sound.
No, but it does render basically all gun control entirely irrelevant. There is no portion of this that cannot be done at home.
Oh, and you raise a great point with the 3D printing. And my wife and I were watching, because I live outside Washington, D.C., and the local news said this was about 6 months ago, these 3D printed guns, we've had a 600% increase in their use in the district. So yeah. I said, wait a minute, that sounds so huge. What is the underlying data? And so I pulled it up, and it was like they had one gun 1 year, the year before, and I think they had 5 or 6 guns this year.
Oh, there you go. Yeah,
but the way it's reported, it's a 600% increase.
Yeah. Well, and before that, it would have been slam fire shotguns and the like.
Yeah,
because as people in chat point out, steel tubes and springs have always been available, guys.
Well, and one of the things that I liked about Axelman's book was, he gets into the abuses of the ATF. And as someone who's read several books on Ruby Ridge and other instances of ATF abuse, the ATF is way out of control and is way exceeding their authority to actually regulate the gun industry or private ownership of guns.
Correct.
They are exceeding their authority, and it's another abuse of power that's executed by the executive branch. And Axelman doesn't pull punches. I mean, he points to the bump stock restrictions that President Trump does. He's very impartial or shall I say, agnostic about what party is driving this. I'm much more leaning that's the left, but he points out, Trump tried to do this and used the ATF to do it, and by using the ATF to do it, he was abusing the power of the presidency. He's right.
He's very true, and I would agree with you in the short term, in the recent history. However, I would agree with him that in the long term, Republicans have been every bit as culpable. It was partially the NRA that allowed the push to happen for gun control in California after the Black Panthers showed up armed at a rally.
Yeah,
it's yeah, all sides bear responsibility for the degradation of our rights.
Well, to me, this, when you look at all of this, and Alu doesn't go there, because his whole thing is, if you look at the title of his book, it's, how do you argue against essentially, gun control? He doesn't go where this is actually going. But I think if you look at all the arguments I've laid out, as well as pulling from his book, a lot of it goes down to, this is all about confiscation. They want to confiscate your guns. And, they've come out, if you watch on, TikTok or watch on Twitter, some of these paid shills, these young Gen Z guys have come out and said, I'll go out and round up these guns. And my comment back was, I want that to be a reality TV show.
Oh, yeah.
I want to watch you show up with a bunch of gun registration cards in hand and tell some guy, I'm here to get your guns, and have him go, wait here.
Stack up.
Because that's going to be a show that's there. I applaud the fact that they're the first people I've seen that are saying, hey, I'm willing to go round up these guns. Everybody else who's in favor of confiscation of assault weapons, etc., is very big on letting other people go out and do it. And to me, that's very cowardly to go, well, I just want them rounded up. The police can go do that. And if that doesn't work, we'll send the army. I want you to think about that weird argument. Like, we're going to send the army in to round up people's individual guns.
So I'm not sure if you're aware of this. There's a study that occasionally gets brought up. And it gets brought up interestingly because they're like, oh, the U.S. government was looking to see if people would do this. The Marines were polled, I think, in the 80s or 90s by a Marine Corps officer who is actually a pro-Second Amendment advocate, who was allowed. He had to do some research for college purposes, and he was allowed by the Marine Corps to have access to Marines to ask questions. And he asked what their feelings would be if they were asked to participate in a gun confiscation. And the answers were not overwhelmingly poor, but he was later found out that he had actually been reported by several of the Marines for how disturbing they found just the very thought of being asked to participate in something like that. The answers, very, very few, in fact, responded in the affirmative that they would go and do such a thing. It's probably not going to go the way a lot of those people think that's going to go.
Well, and they're confiscating guns from law-abiding citizens who have legally registered their weapons. That's what will happen. So they're disarming the part of the population that's not a problem.
Yeah. Yep.
They're not disarming the part of the population who has illegal guns, who get them specifically to conduct illegal activities such as drugs and robberies and carjackings and things along those lines. The problem with gun confiscation is it will never work in this country. And the concept, by the way, of, well, if we ban the weapons, people will simply turn them in. I always say this: if that's the case, Democrats should line up right now today and turn in all of their weapons. Now, of gun ownership in this country, around 20% is owned by people who are completely pledged to be the Democrats. 31% of them live in a house that has guns. If confiscation or turning in your weapons was a solution, then you first.
Oh, well, I think that they got a taste of, and they do a lot of this sometimes, is they'll fly some of these things as trial balloons just to see what the response will be. The estimated response for the recent short barrel, for the not the short barrel rifle, the pistol brace ban, the rate of compliance now that we've passed the date is estimated to be between 0.3 and 0.8%.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I have a friend who works at Congress. I'm not going to expose who he is because he's a conservative, but he works for a liberal congressman. And when the George Floyd riots were happening in 2020, he said it was kind of interesting because he's a very big gun person. He was very open about it, et cetera. He said literally the entire staff of the congressman's office approached him at one point or another and said, "Can you help me buy a gun?" And he said, the representative you work for is actually very much a gun control advocate. And they're like, "Yeah, but I don't feel safe coming into DC." And he's like, "Well, you have to have a permit just to have a gun in DC. You can't carry it armed. You can't carry it, with a magazine. You're limited by what the magazine size is. There's so many restrictions that are on you. You can't do that." And he said they actually got nervous about that. They were like, "Well, that's not fair." And it's funny how their ideals change dramatically when there's an actual perceived threat to their own lives.
No, this is something I've encountered very consistently. I've never met a gun control advocate whose beliefs stood up to the test of having somebody come stalk them, or having somebody threaten them, or even just starting to have their neighborhood degrade fairly badly. It's literally, this is why it was ensconced as a God-given right, something that cannot be infringed by the government, by the founders in the first place, is that it is the natural response of a person to seek to defend themselves when threatened. And we try to allow people to do so in the most efficient way possible. Because otherwise you have the tyranny of the strong and nothing else. It's hilarious that in my opinion, that feminists aren't the most rabid gun advocates in the world, because it is the great equalizer.
My daughter is a nurse, and she was working in a hospital several years ago at night, and people were being attacked in the parking lot because there are people who are out trying to get drugs, and they try to attack people coming out of a hospital at night. She got a concealed carry permit, and I 100% endorse it, and so does her mother. We both are in favor of her carrying a gun, and it's because it has nothing to do with her. It has everything to do with the fact that there are evil people out there who will attack a short, pretty blonde girl to try to rob them or inflict other harm upon them. And believe me, you do not want to mess with my daughter. She goes to the range, she keeps up on her skills, and she will down your ass. And I endorse that. I think it's a smart move. And I think a lot of young women who fear for their safety, rather than try to legislate your way out of it, pick up a gun, get a legal concealed carry permit, train yourself in the use of that weapon. It is empowering. And I saw it with my daughter, and I think it's empowering for a lot of young women out there. But you raised a great point. You mentioned the founding fathers, and Axelman in the book, and this is how I'm going to kind of wrap this today a little bit, and I appreciate everybody who's tolerated my rant on this. But Axelman brings up quotes about the founding fathers, and he pointed out in the book, these men had just fought a war to put their lives on the line for their freedoms. So they didn't have to think about the technology. The technology isn't an issue, and it never was for them. It's about the ability to protect yourselves and the inherent right of free men, to be able to have that type of protection, regardless of what it is. And bear in mind, cannons were used often during the Revolutionary War. When they wrote the Second Amendment, they didn't say, this only applies to arms that you can carry on your shoulder. They said arms. They meant, if you want to own a cannon, you should be able to own a cannon.
And in fact, like that is the strangest argument ever from gun control advocates, particularly Biden, the whole you couldn't own a cannon. Not only did we have people who wrote the Second Amendment explicitly say in writing that we still have preserved in their original letters to and from people saying, yes, explicitly, you can own a cannon. People still own cannons today. The flag of Texas features a civilian-owned cannon which caused a dispute. It's what?
Yeah. I follow a guy on Facebook who he builds cannons. I mean, he has a brass foundry and builds the limbers for them and the caissons and delivers them around the country. And I'm like, I've asked my wife several times, can I have a cannon? She's like, I'm pretty sure it's against the HOA rules.
I think one of my first sergeants was gifted a cannon when he was getting out.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I think it's great. And you got to bear in mind, because I live here in Virginia, when you come out of our subdivision, it's in the middle of the wilderness battlefield. There is a cannon from the National Park Service parked.
That's awesome. I was just going to say that most Midwestern towns have various bits of World War II equipment just kind of scattered around public parks and on street corners. I don't. Anyhow, we don't need to get into that.
Well, no, but, there's two of these quotes, and Axelman has probably a dozen of these quotes in the book, and I encourage you to pick up a copy of Alu's book. It's really good. But I narrowed on two that I liked. Okay, one was from Noah Webster, and it's from an examination of the leading principles of the federal Constitution, October 10th, 1787. Okay, so this is, shall we say, a person of the period. Okay, before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every country in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops. Another man who had distinct opinions about the Constitution and about the Second Amendment is Thomas Jefferson. And he had a very short quote that I liked out of all the lists there, and there's several from Jefferson in the book. No free man shall ever be disbarred the use of arms. He doesn't specify, and if technology changes, that this is subject to change. And he doesn't say you can't own a cannon. He's saying we don't block the ability to use arms.
You know,
That's
and I want to. I wanted. It's a great day for that quote, given that we're on the same week that a federal court just ruled that felons, once they've served their terms, can now be rearmed, because that's something that I feel it's another area that I feel that we've severely strayed on.
It's crazy. We're living in a world anyway where it's almost like you're living in an alternate reality sometimes by the way things are projected by the media and the way that politicians twist facts and try to distort things that we see every day. But the Constitution isn't distortable. It's not. It's subject to a certain degree of interpretation, and I understand that. But you look at the 14th Amendment. It tells us that it's very clear that all people must have a certain degree of equal protection under the law. It doesn't say, well, but if you're on certain kinds of meds or you're not allowed to have certain freedoms. It doesn't say that. It's literally saying, like, look, everybody has the same right. And those rights there's certain rights that the government can't take from you. And to me, that's where these guys started from. And I think we need to take a look at that. Now, the Pocket Guide to Killing Gun Control, if you're a gun guy, you're going to read this in probably 25 minutes and you're going to go, I agree with this and I wish he had written more. And trust me, Alu cranks out about 8 books a year. Chances are he'll come back to this at some point. He did a great book on corona fascism, which talked about the coronavirus and how it was used by the government to achieve dictatorial powers. I thought it was a fantastic book. But this book, The Pocket Guide to Killing Gun Control, this is something if you have friends that go, well, I'm a big gun control person, and you haven't wanted to argue with them about it, this is the kind of book you should be giving them. Hand it to them and let them read it. And if they still feel the way they do, well, at least they've educated themselves a little bit as to, the foundational basis for people who support the ownership of the means of personal protection. Do we have any other comments or questions we ought to hit, Watcher?
There have been some good ones. I've got this one that look, this one needs to be said with a certain accent. So, Blaine's daughter is a nurse who can operate a ventilator.
Oh my God, I've got to have her watch this show. She's going to love it. Yeah, she will open you up.
Phil Coggins says we can turn our gardens into parks of artillery if it's our prerogative. Here.
Like
here. Skinny Biomed says that he poured a small cannon in his high school forge. Very
nice.
Cool.
That's
very
back
cool.
when they used to let you do metal shop and wood shop and stuff.
Yeah, 1990.
Yeah. We've taken away a lot of those trade skills, and that's a whole different subject for me to go into. But
we had to afford all those administrators, Blaine.
Yeah. See, Kyle. Yeah, we had to get them all goose stepping the same way. So, this has been great, folks. I do appreciate everybody who's chimed in on this. I think gun control is a subject that keeps coming back every time there's an incident. Be it a mass shooting or a shooting that upsets people. And I think we've got to take a serious look at the subject. We need a good level debate on this subject. When people say, let's restrict the gun laws, we need to have a level debate about it. Right now, I don't feel like we have that. I feel like the media and the politicians are controlling that narrative. And I think a book like this is a great way to kind of upset that apple cart. And I'm all about doing that.
Yeah. And I want to encourage anybody out there in the audience. We have some very passionate Second Amendment defenders. Remember that when they take away all the regular avenues of debate, you write pamphlets, my friend.
Yeah.
It's an age-old tradition.
It is. And, I've had people tell me, you're not a real patriot. All you do is write books. And I'm like, I write books about real patriots. I'm not likely at 60 years old to be taking up arms, although there are days. There are days. Well, I want to thank you all for joining in. Please join us. Make sure you click on the like button and subscribe. Can
we give them a sneak peek for next week?
I've got a couple authors lined up. I gotta see which ones we can get schedule wise. It's always tricky to get writers depending on their lifestyle and where they live to get on our show. But if we don't, we'll do another book review or talk a little bit about writing in general, because I've got some great notes I want to share. A lot of people have asked me questions about how do I get a book published and what should I be looking at for that. And I get a lot of questions about that. And I kind of think it'd be kind of cool at some point to do an episode on that.
Do a little writer's dojo time.
Yeah. Why not? Well, anyway, thank you all very much. 4th of July is coming up. Celebrate your rights as an American.
We'll see you next week, folks.